Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to continue on with our journey and our conversations and our discussions with regard to those feature films directed by the one, the only, the great, brilliant artist, filmmaker, who is Mr. Brian De Palma. And that brings us to a work which is from the early 1970s. In some sources, it's described as being having been released in 1972. And other sources date it at 1973. And that's due, I understand, to the release schedule of this film at certain points during the scope of those 2 years, 72 and 73. For instance, it has a Criterion Collection release, and such Criterion Collection release describes it as being from 1973. And in any case, my dear friends, I'm speaking about the film which has a brilliant cast, included in which are, for example, Jennifer Salt and William Finley and Charles Durning and, of course, Margot Kidder in this work, which is Sisters. Wow, what a film. This is one of my absolute favorite films from Brian De Palma, and I'm very excited to be able to share with you some thoughts and comments I have about this really brilliant work. Let me then say just in advance that I'd like to focus my comments today in this video in two components. So first is a general impressions section, so non-spoilers, again, for the benefit in particular for those who have not yet seen this great work from Brian De Palma, this mystery thriller from Brian De Palma. So first part of this video is general discussions, non-spoiler, and then with some advance warning, this video will lead into a more plot-specific, spoiler-filled discussion of this great film, Sisters. So again, let us begin with a general impressions talk, and then let's move forward. I think from the outset, first, let me say, too, in this general impressions, that this is the Arrow Video Blu-ray release. This is Region B. There's also a Region A Criterion Collection Blu-ray release, which is what I have here. And whatever works for you, I think any of these options, I think there's a really great way to engage with this film. The supplements are somewhat different if you go from one to the other, so that might be something to consider when trying to choose if you have, for instance, the capacity of playing either Region B or Region A. In any event, you're getting a lot of great stuff, and you're getting the film itself, Sisters, in either case, which is, of course, the main attraction of any release of this film. And why is it the main attraction? Because it is a darn good film. This is a really good film. This is one of my favorites from Brian De Palma. It, in many ways, is a new chapter in the filmography of Brian De Palma. You know, up to now, in terms of the filmography, we have had this very almost experimental theater-like fashion when we look at films like Dionysus in '69. We've had this great way in which De Palma infuses humor and comedy with satire and social commentary with films like Greetings and Hi Mom. And we've also seen the comic aspect and the zany and the episodic comic sketch nature in those films and in other films like, say, Get to Know Your Rabbit, etc. And in fact, we have seen the maybe experimental filmmaking mode combined with a sense of a murder mystery in an earlier work which is called Murder a la Mode. So perhaps in many ways, this film, Sisters, can be said to be a return in terms of the thriller genre, if we think of Murder a la Mode in that vein. At the same time, however, I think this film, Sisters, is also standing in terms of it's standing quite independently, and I think it's forging a new chapter. It's the beginning of a new chapter in Brian De Palma's filmography, because not only is it a suspense thriller film, it is so emphatically a suspense thriller film, a murder mystery film with scenes, very intense scenes, sometimes quite violent, sometimes quite emotionally and psychologically complex. And with a story with a lot of revolutions, a lot of twists and turns, a lot of pulling back the curtain, peeling down the layers until we get at the heart of the matter. And even when we get there, we're not quite sure if what we're seeing is really what's going on, or maybe there's something else somewhat sinister bubbling just beneath the surface, waiting to emerge and explode, much like the shock of some kind of sudden emergence of feeling or violence or anger or temptation, or yes, indeed, murder and death. So this is, in many ways, a very emphatic exclamation, declarative statement of Brian De Palma and company of the suspense film genre. And those elements, I think, are further amplified in a brilliant way, or embellished and supported in a brilliant way in terms of the technique and visual and audio and musical styles that are accompanied here. So we have the brilliant almost explosion of technique in terms of the movement of camera, the use of split screen, the use of perspective, and a camera that is very much receding in the background but also invasive when it needs to be, and the use of zooms, and also the use of things in foreground and background, and characters that seem to be floating in the background, but then suddenly emerge in its almost absurdist or comical way, while at the same time giving us a bit of shock and fright, or not just a bit, quite a lot, in fact, a lot of shock and fright as well. There's also this, in that way too, the style is very much a visceral visual treat for the senses, and a treat for the senses, in that we have this this almost maze-like way in which the film constructs images. And we have this almost perversely subjective, surreal way that this film even turns and reveals information to us. And sometimes perspective is forced upon us, and we are left wondering whose subjective perspective we are indeed experiencing the film through, because there are ways in which this film is also playing with and experimenting with in a truly successful way the notion of shifting perspectives. So this is done in a visual camera technique way, in terms of point of view shots and other types of quote unquote special sequences, and then also it's done in a way that is meant to echo or mirror the plot that involves this idea of or many ideas, one of which being the notion of perspective and characterization, and also whose perspective is being involved in a particular scene in a given moment in time in the film. So let me put it that way. So there is much here in terms of the story, and also the visual structure and the thematic style. So it is all coming together, which is a great thing in the context of Brian De Palma's filmography, and also in the context of this suspense murder mystery film. Also, I should say too that there is the way in which this film, actually, I forgot to mention too that also a way in which that is supported is through the application of the music. Now, this is the music from the great legend Bernard Herrmann, and the score here is top notch. I mean, it's one of the most brilliantly eerie and chilling scores that just announces itself immediately, and it grabs you. It grabs you by the, I mean, one can say grabs you by the throat, and it doesn't let you go. You know, that it has that type of aggressive horror about it, which is so necessary, I think, for the furtherance of the real shock and impact that this film really has in plentiful helpings, I should say. So that is, I think, another great strength of this film. So it's a combination of many different elements that highlight the murder, mystery, suspense aspect of this film. And also, it is not just a murder, mystery, suspense film that is scary. It is also very funny. It has moments of humor and comedy that are mixed in a a very sometimes subtle way and also sometimes not so subtle way, and it sometimes can be mixed in the way that characters are suddenly emerging on the screen as though they come out of nowhere, or maybe there's a broad physical comedy aspect as well to it, or there are just the situations of the plot are just so absurd that they make one want to laugh out loud. And indeed, also too, there is this interesting psychological effect that happens in horror films and scary movies when one is watching a film, or when I'm watching a film that is very scary, and it's suddenly I'm shocked and startled by a scary moment in the film. Sometimes a natural reaction after that is to want to laugh out loud in order to ease the tension that the viewer has. I certainly have experienced that time and time and time again. So, in an interesting way too, from the viewpoint of a viewer experiencing a scary film like Sisters, there is this way in which the immediate gut reaction after a shock or thrill or horror film type moment is to laugh out loud. So in many ways too, the horror film suspense aspect of the film is also linked very naturally to the notion of laughter and thus comedy. So I think a multitude of levels, this film is both a suspense, mystery, thriller, horror film, and it's also a comedy with a lot of humorous bits. And also, we have seen in the past Brian De Palma filmography how he is such a proponent of comedy and humor, slapstick comedy, silent film, comedic techniques, intricacies through dialogue and character mannerisms, etc. So Brian De Palma is also a comedic filmmaker as well as a thriller filmmaker. So I think we see both of those elements combined in this film, Sisters, in a really wonderfully, wildly inventive way. So in those ways, this film, I think, sits very comfortably in the canon of Brian De Palma, while at the same time, as I mentioned, announcing a new chapter, in the manner of speaking, in the context of De Palma's filmography overall. I should say, too, that this film also has had, in the conversation about it, I think a lot has been made in terms of the film seeming to be like an homage to Hitchcock, or maybe some might say, or from a cynical point of view, some might say ripoff of certain Hitchcock films. Now, there are, I would suggest, a number of definite connections with Hitchcock films, and I'll try to discuss those in more detail, at least how I view them, when we get into the more plot detailed spoiler conversation of this video. But suffice to say that I think those are there, those connections are there. The director Brian De Palma, in a number of interviews, has indeed stated as such, and I think there is this homage element, and also a real use of the tools and techniques that have been made so successful in a lot of the Hitchcock works throughout that master of suspense's own a brilliant filmography and canon. But there's also something to be said about how Brian De Palma is using those techniques in a way that is very much individual and stylized and his own. And also there are some techniques that are really quite, one can say, quite radically different from how Hitchcock might have been employing a similar type of storyline in some of his films in the Hitchcock canon. So I look at it as a type of connection. I don't see this film as a type of ripoff of Hitchcock works, and I'll try to explain a little bit why I feel that way in the latter half of this video. And I see it as almost a continuation of those techniques while also forging its new path. And so and ultimately, this film is its own film, and I strongly view it that way. And I continue to view it that way because it has characteristics that are wholly its own, and it really uses and exploits those characteristics to full effect every time I watch it. So those are some of the reasons, in a very general way, why I really, really love this film, Sisters, and I can recommend it to anyone who is already on a Brian De Palma cinema journey. It is a thriller film, and so if you have seen some of the other Brian De Palma thrillers, mystery thrillers, and you're okay with that type of mystery thriller, then Sisters is definitely for you. I can strongly recommend this. If you are okay with certain scenes of violence and intensity, then I can also say that If you are interested in a journey of Brian De Palma films, then this is one stop along the way that you must make. It is one of my favorites in his filmography, and I'm looking forward to discussing it in a little bit more detail in the next part of this video. But for now, this is Sisters. All right, my dear friends, so from here on in, I want to talk about a plot-specific, spoiler-filled discussion of the film Sisters. So if you have not yet seen the film Sisters, my strong encouragement to you is to turn off this video and in your own good time, in a time that is convenient to you in your schedule, please watch the film Sisters, and then after you've seen the film Sisters, you can always come back to this YouTube channel and to this video at any time. This video will still be up, and at that point in time, my dear friends, we can talk, you and I, about this work, Sisters. So from here on in, let's talk about it in some detail. All right, so you're back, or you're still here. So that means we can talk about this this film, Sisters. And wow, what a film this is! I said it before, but I'll say it again. It is one of my favorites from Brian De Palma. I love this. I watch this film on a regular basis, and every time I'm just so thoroughly entertained and so shocked and so I've seen it so many times, but the scares in this film still get me. And the way it's shot, the way that the music just seeps into one's pores, it just creeps into your skin. I'm talking about the Bernard Herrmann score and the eeriness of it, as well as the combination of some real arresting and quite disturbing images, such as the close-up of the eye when we get into that really bizarre dream sequence point of view, dream sequence shifting perspective, when we get to the clinic and Emile and the way in which he is manipulating the mind of Grace Collier. That's the Jennifer Salt character, the reporter who is really caught in a really terrible situation at the climax of this film, as well as the sequences involving the murders and the violence. And I'm speaking, of course, of the very famous or infamous scene at the first half or the first part of this film regarding Philip and the birthday cake and Dominique suddenly emerging from beneath the sheets with the kitchen knife, and so in a very, very bloody scene that comes seemingly out of nowhere. Which is one of the great shocks of Brian De Palma's thriller cinema. Indeed, it's one of the great shocks, I think, of 1970s cinema. So for those, in many ways, when I watch this film and rewatch this film, it still gets me, and it always gets me for these and many other reasons. So, my dear friends, why do I feel this way? Well, I think one of the things is I enjoy its plot. I love how it's paced. It's paced in these very well-paced, easily digestible, say, units or components. And, we have to remember here, this is screenplay by De Palma and Louisa Rose. Louisa Rose, there's a really great interview with her on one of the supplements for the Arrow release, for example. But here we have a type of a collaboration between the two, also credited in terms of original story by Brian De Palma. And we have this original story that, as I say, is, I think, arranged in very, very easily digestible components, because each has its own little beginning, middle, and end, and we go to the next part. So, for example, the film starts with this story of the peeping toms and the television show, or the show of what would one do if one is caught in this type of risque situation of a woman who's seemingly, she cannot see, but she is she's undressing while there is a man there. What would the man do? And so that leads into the relationship between Philip and Danielle, the Margot Kidder character here. We see a little bit of Emile, the William Finley character. They meet, they have a date, and they hit it off, and then they get together for an intimate moment. And then there are some mystery elements that are introduced and interwoven into that. So, but we have this component, which is essentially type of romance between two characters. And there's an interesting, intriguing setup involving voyeurism and sexuality. And also there's this intriguing element involving the husband or ex-husband, as it's described by Danielle during the during the dinner date. There's this element of maybe a race and racial representation and race relations and sort of the insensitivity of the moment, with regard to the restaurant that is part of the prize from the show, etc. But all in all, this is my way also to say that this component is structured in a way that I think is very easily digestible. Two characters meet and they have an attraction, and then they have a date, and then they have an intimate moment, while also interweaving these threads that will then create a sense of unease, or maybe something that we will pick up in later components of the film. And then we go to another component of the film, which almost seems like a new film in and of itself, because it's the next morning, and then we have Danielle and this idea of the medicine or the pills of some sort, which have a type of chemical balancing effect, we see, but we're not quite sure exactly what those pills might do to her, except maybe there's a type of calming effect. But before we get to those, we also are introduced to the concept of another person or another character being present in the space. And we know this from the shadow, but we're not, and the voices, but we're not quite sure. And this is, of course, a reference to the sisters. Danielle, as we later hear from Phil, when she's talking to Philip, has a sister, a twin sister, Dominique, who's visiting, and according to Danielle. And according to Danielle, today's their birthday. And so we have this component too of the sisters, and then maybe some kind of trauma or difficulty or stress that Danielle is facing, because she is somewhat upset when Philip meets her. And so we have the part two of the story. Again, another easily digestible chunk of the film, another component, which is itself its own little mini movie, leading to the boyfriend-to-be, as it were, trying to run errands for the girlfriend-to-be, and including the medicine refill, as well as the birthday cake surprise. And so this is where that sort of lovely type of setup is continued on. So we have these components, right? And already I want to suggest, in terms of the description of this, is that it feels almost like its own type of sketch or episodic structure. I know they're all interconnected, yes, but at the same time, there's a type of episodic structure to it, which is already, I think, echoing something that we've seen from past Brian De Palma films. I mean, Greetings has this episodic structure to it. The Wedding Party has this episodic structure to it. Hi Mom, I think, has its episodic structure to it. While there are, of course, continuations and threads of continuity between and among those structured portions. And that's certainly the case for Sisters, because we have what could be said to be the climax of this component leading into the beginning of the next component, that is the murder, which is shocking as it's sudden, and it's violent, and it's eerie and spooky. And with the face of Margot Kidder, who is now dressed in black, emerging from the sheets, I will never forget when I first saw the picture. There was a book of horror movies that I had as a kid, and one of the horror movies that was discussed in that book was Sisters, and there was a huge picture of Margot Kidder's face as she emerges from the sheets here, Dominique, with the twisted way in which she manipulates the look of her chin and her lip, and the kind of the way that she's showing her teeth in this almost evil cackle captured on this frame with the knife. It's moving at such a speed that it's blurred. It's really quite a shocking picture, and I've never been able to shake that from my mind, because it's so chilling. And when you see it played out in this film, it's really one of the most it's really quite bloody, and it's really quite it comes out of nowhere. And with the calm and the lull, and the soothing aspect of the Bernard Herrmann score, as Philip is walking very slowly with the cake, with this smile on his face, wanting to surprise the person who he thinks is Danielle in the bed there, in the fold-out sofa bed. And he says, surprise, and he says, you can't cut the cake until you blow, right, and you blow out the candles and you make a wish, right? And so that's where suddenly we see the knife twists slightly, because we know that the person has grabbed it. and suddenly it flashes, and then just it turns into chaos, mayhem, and violence. And it's also attacking the wounds themselves. I mean, the wounds are, I think, a big part of this in terms of the way this film deals with sexuality, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But here we then go into the new component of this, which is the story involving Emile and Danielle and the murder and the discovery of the murder and what he is doing to try to essentially help her cover up the murder, and something to do with Dominique. Dominique is here. She was here. So there is some mystery element as to where Dominique is and what her position is. While that's going on, we have the story of Grace Collier on the other side of the way there. And then we have her interactions and her the quick shots of her suddenly emerging into the foreground in terms of the investigation, calling the police, calling the authorities, believing that there's been a murder because she sees the glimpse of the dying Philip trying to write in his own blood on the glass there. And then we go into the other components of the film in terms of the structure, the shifting perspective leading us from the Danielle Emile Breton perspective to the Grace Collier perspective after the failure of the police to follow up with the investigation and the inquiry from Grace. She decides to go on her own, and with a bit of help and encouragement, she and with the cooperation of the private detective, the Charles Durning character, Larch, right? Then they go and discover that there is another component here in terms of where the body is and the couch on the one hand. So that's another component, with the Larch character, the Charles Durning character, and the tailing of the moving van. And then also that there's another component too, which is Grace Collier's further investigation leading into investigation, Life magazine meeting the McLennan character. This is Bernard Hersey character, and talking about the Blanchin twins and who they were and what the significance was of Danielle and Dominique, what happened to Dominique, and the conjoined twins concept is introduced, or not the concept, but the conjoined twins aspect of their characters are introduced. As you understand, that there is a sister, a twin sister, Danielle and Dominique. But then something happened, and the story is a bit hazy here, except to say that McClellan heard from one of the suture nurses after giving some money over that after or upon surgery to try to separate the conjoined twins, Dominique died. And so whether this is true or not, that leads to yet another easily digestible component or part or episode of the film, namely where Grace Collier then tries to investigate the clinic, or one of the clinics that appears, and we find out through her surprise and shock that the clinic is run by none other than Emile Breton. And here we have finally one of the great climaxes of any Brian De Palma film, which is yet another component or episode of this, which is the dream sequence, or the very violent structure of the dream sequence that just totally throws physics out the window. It seems like we are seeing things from different perspectives. We are seeing things from her perspective, but from whose perspective we're seeing, we're not quite sure. We seem to be looking at it from a point of view shot that suddenly turns objective, because we see Grace Collier in the frame itself, standing in the position of what we understand to be that of Dominique, the sister of Danielle, who's also in the space as well, portrayed by Margot Kidder. And then we have the explanation with these wonderfully extreme close-up shots and use of lenses, and a sort of backstory about the stresses between Danielle and Dominique, and the need for that has a type of sexual tension as well as sexual jealousy, and also violence because of the loss of the baby, the expecting baby, the pregnancy that Danielle says that she has, but she lost the baby due to some kind of violent altercation between her and her sister that seems to be stemming from sexual jealousy, at least according to Danielle. And then this leads to the final confrontation and violent act, which is the killing of Emile Breton, in a very similar, gross and quite disturbing way that reminds us too of how Philip died in the earlier film. And then we have the final denouement, or the epilogue, that is there was no body, right? because there was no murder, and that leads to that final question mark of what's going to happen to these characters in this world. We're not sure. The only thing left is Charles Durning still up there on that telephone pole or not, or that electricity pole or not, looking over with the binoculars, and is that cow still there, and is that couch still there? What's going on? The end. So my point with this is that it has a, I think, episodic structure that is also, through lines of continuity, don't get me wrong, but it has an episodic structure that allows for a number of things. First of all, it reminds us of the way in which Brian De Palma makes his films in the past. Again, episodic structures abound in films like The Wedding Party and Greetings and Hi Mom, etc. And indeed, to a certain extent, too, I think a film like Get to Know Your Rabbit as well, but with the continuity through lines to boot. So that's one thing. It also, I think, reminds us, too, of the fact that with episodic structures, we are automatically allowed or permitted to change perspectives, because with each differing episode, we get a differing perspective. For example, the first perspective, or the first episode, one can say is primarily from the perspective of Philip. This young man who becomes later the victim of Dominique, right? So that, I think, is one of the benefits of this episodic structure, because we start from the perspective of one character, and then we can shift maybe slowly or gradually or organically to the perspectives of different characters. And one can say, therefore, that after the murder has been committed, maybe sometime slightly before, but definitely when the murder is committed and after that, we reach the perspective of Danielle, and also, to a certain extent, Emile Breton. And then at the same time, or parallel to that, simultaneous to that, and thanks to the brilliance of the split screen that happens in this component, we have the continuing perspective of yet another character, which is Grace Collier. And so this episodic structure, I would say, allows for the shift in perspective. And then we go into the full-on mode of Grace Collier's investigation with Larch, the Charles Durning character, to help out, although they do go in separate directions towards the end there. Larch with his perspective, and then Grace Collier with her perspective. Well, when you get to her perspective at the very end, my goodness, what happens to it is it's totally upended. The balance is shifted and cracked and even destroyed, thanks to the brilliant aspect of this dream sequence, this nightmare sequence, this sequence of hypnosis and mind manipulation. That really calls into question the whole reality of the situation that we've come to see all the way from the beginning of the film. So not only do you have this episodic structure that allows for shifting perspectives, but those perspectives are destroyed by the very end, leaving us wondering, questioning, where are we at the very final shot? And indeed, the very final shot, what are we left with? But indeed, the final perspective, the subjective perspective, that is Charles Durning looking through the binoculars at the cow and the couch. And not just that perspective, but indeed it zooms out, and it's not just his perspective looking down, but it's our perspective looking at him, which is, I think, a wonderful meta way to end this film. Again, the layering of perspectives, which is very important in this and in other films by Brian De Palma. And we see this, and continuing into a different conversation, we see this in other ways in the film of perspectives, voyeurism, looking, characters observing. We see this not just in the way the film opens, right, with the peeping Tom section, and what would Philip do when he is basically in a position to look upon a woman, a very attractive young woman who is in a state of undress, or getting undressed. So what would he do? So this is voyeurism on display, but it's not just his act of voyeurism, but it's the audience looking at this, seeing how he will react. So it's voyeurism upon voyeurism. Plus, it is us, the viewer, who is looking at this program of the character looking at a young woman. So it's voyeurism upon voyeurism upon voyeurism. And so this is the type of tunnel vision aspect that I think is part of the sisters' landscape dynamic. It's present at the end. It's also present at the beginning. So in an interesting way, this film bookends quite remarkably. And indeed, to this idea of looking is a very important thing. For example, at night when we're back at Staten Island apartment, Danielle looks down and she sees, for example, Emile looking from the ground there in the darkness. He is looking at her up to the window. She is looking at him. So the perspective is not just forced, it's also mutual. and Philip also recognizes this as well. So this type of idea of perspective and voyeurism and shifting focus, I think, is at the heart of this film, or one of the hearts of this film, Sisters, and also indeed at the heart of Brian De Palma's filmography overall. We've seen it before in other films, and I dare say we will see it again in subsequent films. So let's keep that in mind. Also, indeed, too, perhaps before we move on to the next topic, voyeurism perspective, I think perhaps one of the most iconic shots is the zoom in to the eye, or the zoom out into the eye. It's a very intense, extreme zoom in and zoom out when we're talking about the eye, which we assume is that of Grace Collier. When we go into and then are suddenly removed from this forced perspective dream nightmare vision at the climax of the film. So, I mean, if we're talking about an image that lasts in terms of a discussion of voyeurism and subjective perspective, that zoom in, zoom out of the eyeball is it. It's really quite startling indeed. So this is a very important aspect of Sisters, I would say. Also, too, we have the notion of the mystery element, and the mystery element is described in what one might call this psychological terms within the context and within the context and backdrop of the film itself. So we understand through all of the clues that we have been able to gather, and Grace Collier has been able to gather. We seem to understand that, and also with the climax that Emile Breton seems to say as he is talking to Danielle, and essentially expressing his love in a very almost in very sexual terms, as he's caressing her breast, and she seems to be quite welcome to that. We understand that the psychological situation here is that Danielle and Dominique were conjoined twins, and they were conjoined at the hip, but we also understand that there was a connection of some spinal cord or nervous system connection. So that meant that they were conjoined, and they grew up in that state. And so when they reached young adulthood and they met or encountered Emile Breton, this is the William Finley character, who is also a doctor, we understand that there was a emotional relationship that developed between, and sexual relationship that developed between Danielle and Emile Breton. And so this also led to some kind of sexual jealousy, or some kind of jealousy. I'm not quite sure if it was sexual or not, but there was some kind of jealousy or violent reaction by Dominique, according to Danielle, because again, according to Danielle, she was going to have a baby, but then when she told Dominique attacked her. That's the story that we hear at the very end, with this extreme close-up of Margot Kidder's face as she's retelling the story from her perspective. And then we understand that her life was in danger, in physical danger, because of this attack, which meant that they had to do a sudden surgery of removing and separating the conjoined twins. And so we have this represented in this film in a very bizarre, surreal way, with this poolside and all the characters there, and this in this almost carnivalesque type of dream nightmare sequence that seems to be out of nowhere. It's just with the cleaver that's used for the purpose of this dream nightmare sequence surgery of separating the conjoined twins. And then with Jennifer Salt and Margot Kidder there, and then with the final strike, Jennifer Salt screams in one of the most chilling screams of any Brian De Palma film, to let out this almost primal shock, as it were. But again, the separation, we understand, and the surgery caused the death of Dominique. And this is, we understand too, that this film takes place about a year or so after this situation had occurred. And so now Danielle is on her own. She is living on her own, but we understand that she is living in a sense of guilt due to the death of Dominique. And Emile Breton explains it, because he says that whenever he tried to kiss her, caress her, make love to her, Dominique would be the dominant personality that would emerge. So Danielle then having different personalities, that of Danielle and also that of Dominique. And the Dominique personality would emerge whenever there was some kind of arousal or some kind of sexual activity that was about to take place between her and Emile. That's according to Emile. Now, this might explain, too, a number of things. This might explain why, at the very end, when he kisses her and there's a close-up on her eyes, suddenly she turns her eyes, and the music informs us that she has become Dominique. And so that, again, is a continuation, or a almost like evidence of what Emile's just told us. Whenever he tried to make love to her, Dominique would appear, and indeed that seems to be the case right now at the very climax of the film. Also, it's intriguing, too, because we have to remember that Philip and Danielle had sex, and we understand that Dominique didn't emerge prior to Philip having sex. I mean, they had an embrace, and she undressed in a moment of intimacy prior to, the act of intercourse. And so, I think that that's a very interesting aspect too, because Dominique did not, we assume, did not emerge prior to this act of lovemaking. In fact, Dominique seems to have emerged quite forcefully after the act of lovemaking. So this might be a type of interesting almost twist in the theory of Emile Breton, namely Emile saying that Dominique emerges prior to lovemaking, whereas here with Philip in the early part of the film, she seems to have emerged after lovemaking. But in any case, Dominique does emerge, and that is maybe one of the ways in which one can say that there is a type of sexual jealousy on the part of Dominique, or perhaps to put it more specifically, this is the way in which maybe Danielle perceives the jealousy that Dominique seems to have had towards Danielle. In other words, this is the way in which Danielle reads her sister, and that she interprets her actions as being that based upon sexual jealousy. Now, whether that's the case or not, we're not sure, because we never meet Dominique in person, right? We see shadows of something that looks like someone else, but it's always from the perspective of Danielle, what Danielle thinks Dominique is, or what the character personality of Dominique is in the mind of Danielle. So whether that's a totally separate thing, or whether that's the way in which Danielle has maybe constructed what she feels Dominique's personality is, perhaps it's the latter rather than the former. And if that's the case, then we have to wonder, is this really Dominique's personality that's being represented accurately, or is it something that is a forced perspective as well? Again, another forced perspective. Danielle's forced perspective on what she believes her sister thought of her, and whether that's true or not, we're not sure. But again, it leads to more very interesting nuances and questions as to the actual relationship between the sisters. After all, we only get the perspective of Emile, and we get the perspective of Danielle describing who Dominique was. We never meet Dominique. So, and in fact, one of the films, the archive films from the Loisel Institute, and the head of the institute there mentioned things about how the theory is that Dominique is maybe the more disturbed twin, and that Danielle is the friendlier twin. But in fact, perhaps it's the opposite, that perhaps Danielle can only be like that because of her sister. And in fact, that might suggest that there might be a precarious psychological state that Danielle had already been in prior to the death of her sister Dominique, which might also go to suggest that maybe Danielle's reading of what Dominique's personality is not as accurate as one might seem. In other words, maybe Dominique is not the quote-unquote evil twin that one might perceive to be when one was watching the film Sisters. But in any event, these, I think, are questions of healthy speculation. I think it's worth talking about. Now, a discussion of Sisters has to go to the way in which the technique and sound and style are combining to form this real assault on the senses in a lot of ways. So I mentioned already the Bernard Herrmann score. It is one of the masterful scores. And Bernard Herrmann is a legend for many reasons, and one of those reasons is Sisters. And in fact, another one of those reasons is the work that he does in the 1970s, including another Brian De Palma film, which we'll talk about in a subsequent discussion. But this score is one of the most chilling, dynamic, weird scores. It's great. I mean, we got it from the very beginning, which is the opening credits and the huge bang announcing the score, and the loud, bombastic way in which it announces itself, and we go over the score, and the weird moog, creepy type of that goes throughout the score, and then that's also tempered by the delicate yet eerie and creepy and scary quality of a type of a soft melody that accompanies, for instance, the scene where Philip is carrying the birthday cake into the room, and also the scene where the zoom out at the very end with Charles Durning up there on the pole. So there's a lot of softness, and there's a lot of bombastic loudness, but in any event, it's always Bernard Herrmann, and so that combination is really quite splendid indeed. And then of course we have the visual technique and style of this work by De Palma. I should mention the director of photography Gregory Sandor, but we have the split screen. I mean, this is one of the key examples of the split screen technique in the hands of De Palma, and it is done to brilliant effect. We see two stories happening at once. We see on the one side we have the Jennifer Salt, Grace Collier character's story trying to get the police moving in the investigation. We also have the story of Emile and Danielle, almost primarily Emile, really trying to clean up all evidence of the murder of Philip and the apartment there. So, and whether they will interact or not, there are moments when they almost combine, and they create these very suspenseful moments. I mean, not talk about forced perspective and shifting perspectives. We feel, in a way, we don't want Danielle and Emile to get caught. So there are moments when they almost see each other in the hallway, and we understand that this split screen is actually taking place in real time in a manner of speaking, which is brilliant. It's brilliant. It just adds to the bravura and the almost mesmerizing aspect of this film. And also, we are dealing with I mean, if we're talking about perspectives and different perspectives, we're talking about two perspectives at the same time, which is almost the epitome of Brian De Palma and the idea of subjectivity. It's brilliant, absolutely. And it's done in a very clinical way. It's very precise, almost scientific and mathematical. So it's objectively subjective in this a wonderful paradoxical way. So I think it's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. It's one of the great examples of split screen. I mean, we'd seen split screen done in a very intriguing way in an earlier work called Dionysus in '69, but here it's done to this thriller suspense effect to the max. Also, we have the way in which, and we should bring it up here, the way in which the film can be said to be homages, or maybe from a cynical point of view, rip-offs of Hitchcock. And this turns into, or this is one of the examples of where we have this conversation of, is Brian De Palma, is he merely ripping off Hitchcock, Alfred Hitchcock? And I am in the camp, I'm firmly in the side of saying that Brian De Palma is not ripping off Hitchcock. This is not a ripoff of Psycho. There are elements that one can say are similar to a film like Psycho. There are elements which are very similar to a film like Rear Window. There are elements of this film which are very similar to a film like Vertigo. But it's not the same story, so it's not like, we're not talking about a remake of those films, obviously. That's one thing. But the techniques that can be said to be applied from the world of Hitchcock filmmaking are, for example, the POV shot, or the way in which mirrors and framed windows are used to augment the sense of voyeurism. One character, Grace Collier, looking through her window into the apartment across the way. They're seeing the murder, also seeing Charles Durning a little bit later in the film, and also seeing Emile and Danielle observing, peeping Tomism, and this is very much a rear window aspect. But it's done in a way that is not the focus of the film. I mean, Sisters is not primarily a film about this peeping Tom aspect. It's there, but it's not the primary aspect of the film. So it's, in that way, it's not a remake of Rear Window, although it can be said to be borrowing elements from Rear Window. And also we have the way in which things that we see through the window and perspective. I mean, this is different from a film like Rear Window, because Rear Window is almost primarily from one perspective looking out into the other, and the other is always something unknown. We're never necessarily in that space. So it's always from one perspective looking out to the other. It's always this unilateral point of view, for the most part, primarily for Rear Window. Whereas with Sisters, both spaces that are part of this Rear Window aesthetic dynamic are occupied by us, the viewer, at some point in the film. That goes back to my my sort of theory that I was positing earlier, which is the way in which this has an episodic structure, thus leading to the ability to shift perspectives at any given moment. One perspective is Grace Collier's apartment, looking from her apartment to the other side there. The other perspective is actually from Margot Kidder's apartment, Danielle's apartment, looking towards Grace Collier's apartment. So it's actually going both ways, this Rear Window aspect of Sisters. And so in that way, it is not unilateral like the Hitchcock film. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. The unilateral aspect is applied in the Hitchcock film. It's absolutely brilliant. And maybe one day we can talk about Rear Window with more detail on this channel, because I think it's one of my favorite films ever. But this is also my way to say that I don't see this as an example. I don't see this as a type of ripoff of Rear Window, but in fact, I see it as being an example of the use and application of something that was seen in a previous Hitchcock film, but then used in a way that is twisting it and almost a variation on the theme. And the variation is so extreme that it almost becomes its own thing. So that's what I see Brian De Palma doing when he's working with Hitchcock's tools and techniques. It's done in a very loving way. It's done in a very respectful way. It's done in a way that's always acknowledging that. And indeed, Brian De Palma acknowledges his debt to the master of suspense. But I stop short whenever maybe I am engaged in a conversation that might shift or might go in the direction of questioning whether Brian De Palma is just copying Hitchcock. And I don't believe that is the case at all. I don't believe that's the case at all. Take another point, Psycho. I don't want to get too much into detail about the film Psycho and those details, because that's a conversation in and of itself. But there have been some comparisons that have made between this film and Psycho, but I would say that those comparisons are also filled with a lot of differences, thus making very healthy distinctions between the two works. So maybe just as an example, there are some perspectives of, say, there's the idea of, say, the way in which the mystery is sort of unfolding, and the type of mystery that could be said to be based on, say, a perceived notion of sexual jealousy leading to acts of violence, let's put it that way. So in that way, there could be a similarity as well. But we also have to understand, too, that I think those similarities end because the characters, when we think of one work versus the characters in another work, they have a type of differing dynamic. There might be something to be said in terms of a closeness or an intimate aspect to the relationship dynamics in both films, but there's also a difference in the relationship dynamic. And I think that difference makes a huge difference as well, because we're talking about different potentially sexual dynamics, as well as potentially different, say, emotional or psychological dynamics. While the plot structure might seem similar, the emotional and psychological outcomes are potentially quite different because of the positioning of the characters and their relationships with each other. I think they are similar, but they're also distinct from one another, thus making each work, Psycho and Sisters, its own living, breathing thing. So again, I'm sorry to be a bit vague, because I don't want to go into a detailed discussion of Psycho. That's not the point of this. But this is my way of trying to say, in this roundabout way, that I think that there is this homage connection. There's definitely the use of the Hitchcock tools and apparatus aspect of the Hitchcock filmmaking craft, but it's also done in a way that it's wholly its own. That's also paying respect to Hitchcock, but while at the same time doing its own thing here in Brian De Palma's Sisters, and it's done so brilliantly. So I just wanted to make that point. We will talk about this discussion again in later Brian De Palma films. So when we get to discussions of, say, Body Double, or, say, Dress to Kill, or Obsession, we will then talk about this. And even in the discussion of those films, let me say in advance that my feelings about how I feel about the Hitchcock-De Palma connection in a film like Sisters is the same when we talk about a film like, say, Obsession or Body Double. We will get to those discussions when we go into these later video discussions. But now returning to Sisters. For these and other reasons, I find this film to be wholly its own thing. And it's brilliant for that. And also I mentioned, too, the way in which this film blends other themes and concerns that we might say have been recognized in the early part of Brian De Palma's canon leading up to this. Comedy and also social satire and almost a type of scathing indictment of the societal norms in a manner, societal quote unquote norms in a manner of speaking. So two things here. So first is the societal norms, or a type of satire or commentary. And this is done, I think, very subtly here with Grace Collier talking about or making references to apathy in the police force. Also conversations about racist police, and this is her theory, or her very aggressive way to try to suggest that maybe the lack of action on the part of the police could be in response to the fact that Philip is black and Danielle is white, so it's an interracial relationship. So this is suggestive of type of race and racial tension as well. And so we remember from Brian De Palma's work, such as Hi Mom, that racial relation tension is very strongly in the air. And indeed, it is present here in this film, Sisters, even back to the way the film opens with the restaurant, the African room. I mean, even Philip, when he looks at this invitation, he can't. It's so culturally insensitive, but he's so above it that he just shakes his head and laughs it off. It's a really great way of seeing his character, as well as identifying this aspect of the social commentary that I think is part of Brian De Palma's work, such as Hi Mom, and indeed such as Sisters. And then also the other aspect too is comedy. Now, comedy is very much part of the four. For instance, Emile, William Finley, Breton. I mean, he's so tall and he's got this almost hunchback physicality to him. At the point in the apartment when he slips and falls, and later we see him with the huge bruise on his forehead and the beret and these sorts of things. So it's a very almost slapstick comedy thing going on. There's something also very similar, say, with the scene involving Grace Collier and her mother in the car, and that sort of nagging mother-daughter relationship that's also part of it. And then Grace Collier suddenly explodes and she just wants to express what it is she wants. She wants to do things with her life and her career, etc. So I think those sorts of bits of humor and human drama do emerge. And we have to remember too that Brian De Palma is a thriller suspense filmmaker extraordinaire, but he's also a filmmaker that cares about human drama, human relationships, and a lot of those human relationships have to do with humor and comedy and laughing. So we have that in this film in very great, healthy doses, Sisters. So in those ways and others, I would say that this film sits very comfortably in the canon of Brian De Palma's films, while also standing apart on its own, as I say, forging ahead into a new chapter, a new zone, a new frontier, as it were, in the art of Brian De Palma and others. So my dear friends, for these and other reasons, I think that this is a really stellar work. I've said it before, but I'll say it again. This is one of my favorites, one of my absolute favorites from Brian De Palma, and it remains to this day a film that I visit regularly. I love its shocks. I love its surprises. I mean, I love how suddenly you can see things that you haven't seen before. I mean, that might seem like a cliche of film watching and film reviewing critique, but it's definitely the case for me and Sisters. Like sometimes Emile Breton, it's like, there's a game called Where's Waldo? You have this huge picture with all these people, and you have to try to find this character Waldo amongst the things. I have this game that's very similar. Where's Emile Breton? Because he seems to be everywhere in the frame, at least in the first part of the film. You see him somewhere in the background, or you suddenly see a shot of him maybe in the audience somewhere, walking, pacing, sitting at a table or something. So those sorts of games I think are fun to play in a film like Sisters and Brian De Palma. So that's an example too of where I think this film is such a great candidate for watch and rewatch and rewatch and rewatch. And again, it does allow for further questions, as I was trying to hint at before. What is the exact relationship between Dominique and Danielle? What kind of person was Dominique in real life versus is this the actual representation of Dominique that we see enacted via Danielle, or is in fact Dominique someone who is completely different from the way that Danielle essentially inhabits that character? So for these and other questions, also too, what is the relationship between Danielle and Emile? I mean, they are described as husband and wife, or they're described as divorced, ex-husband. And also he says at the very climax, when he is caressing her He says, I'm going to marry you. So maybe they were married, or they're not married, but they're going to get married again, or that's what he wants. And so what is their relationship there? That is also a very intriguing point that we can speculate about. We have clues here and there, but this is a film that, again, through rewatch, there is room for healthy speculation and theorizing, which is one of the great things about this and other works of Brian De Palma. And one of the great questions too, what will happen to the body? Will the body ever be discovered, right? Because after all, there was no body because there was no murder. One of the great lines of any Brian De Palma film, and it's a reminder too of the greatness of the performances here. And the question too is still left hanging: is Charles Durning still up there? My goodness, these and more questions await a viewer upon final rewatch. And I should say too that the performances in this film are dynamite. I mean, I mentioned Grace Collier, Jennifer Salt. We've seen Jennifer Salt, of course, in other Brian De Palma works, and here she is she is at her absolute best. I mean, she is the intrepid reporter. She is aggressive. She is also very stubborn, but in a very good way, because she doesn't let go. She has an instinct about something that happened, and her instinct is indeed correct. Something is afoot. And there are sisters, and she tries to put together the clues. She tries to inspire the police to act. She tries to get that clue with the cake, but unfortunately she slips and falls, and the cake lands on the shoe. But she knows that something is wrong, and so we therefore are with her. And then there are the moments too of the human drama between her and her mother, thus making her, I think, such a sympathetic character that we follow her. Again, a great example of the shifting perspective. So there's Jennifer Salt, and also there is William Finley, the great William Finley. We've seen William Finley in many a Brian De Palma film. We will see him in yet more Brian De Palma films, but here is one of his iconic roles: the creepy, weird, mysterious Emile Breton with that great bruise on his head. I mean, it's perfection. It's weird, creepy, mysterious, and oh so funny, and it's very physical as well. Talk about the way in which he dies too, with the type of wounds that he has. That's another thing too, which is very quite shocking. The wounds that are inflicted upon the male character victims. They are the crotch area, and so I think, and also the mouth as well. So it's very disturbing, very shocking, but it's also suggestive of a type of wounding or inflicting of damage, maybe based upon or premised upon or connected to sexual organs, male sexual organs. And so this is very quite shocking stuff. And there's that way in which he is almost like physical assault on Dominique at the very end there, when he's just grabbing her torso from behind, just as he's at the point of dying, because he's bleeding to death. So it's a very unpleasant set of situations. But that's an example of the physicality, the very aggressive physicality. Sometimes the physicality can be for comic effect. And other times it can be for quite horror film effect, and both are delivered with such brilliance by William Finley. So there's that. And then I have to say too, the great Margot Kidder. I think she is so great here in one might say dual roles, but in fact that's not really the case, because it's really Danielle. It's always been Danielle, but her perception of what she thought Dominique was, and what Dominique thought of Danielle. So in fact, is it two roles, or is it one role with multiple personalities? In any event, this great performance by Margot Kidder is showcasing her great talent. There is a liveliness, there is an attraction, there is a sense of life in her, and curiosity that turns suddenly on a dime into something quite scary and quite sudden. I mentioned it before, that look, the way in which her face is contorted, her lips and chin are contorted in a way that's so horrific in the Dominique mode is quite shocking indeed. It's so telling of the brilliance of Margot Kidder's performance. There's also a scene earlier on when she's looking out the window down onto the nighttime street there, and she sees Emile Breton there, and there's a look after Philip leaves her and she's alone there. It's so subtle and yet so chilling at the same time. And maybe maybe upon rewatch, maybe this is an indication that maybe Dominique is emerging more frequently than one might realize. So in any event, my dear friends, for these and many other reasons, this film, Sisters, is one of my favorites in the Brian De Palma film canon. I love it, and I will continue to love it for my remaining years, and I will continue to revisit it. And it's been my great pleasure to share with you, again, in my own amateurish, non-expert way. I apologize for that. I mean, I'm not in any way an expert. I haven't done this film at all, any justice at all. But what I've tried to convey here is the reasons why I really love this film, which is Sisters. Okay, my dear friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. So until the next video, my dear friends, thank you and cheers.